Good morning. Earlier this year, and towards the end of last year, something I made mention of my plans, something I wanted to include in this year was more lessons where I preach through a book, where I start at the beginning and just kind of go through the text each week, kind of as a sequence or series of lessons. And so I'm going to do that this morning, but I'm going to do something else as well. I'm trying to go through some of the books that maybe have been more neglected traditionally, and including myself. And that being said, we're going to look at Lamentations over the next couple of weeks. This is a book, I might be surprised if I saw too many folks out there, if I asked for a show of hands, who's read this in the last month or two. And I might be surprised, if there was more than one or two of you perhaps. This is a book that seldom gets studied, I fear. And I say this again a lot from personal experience. It's been a while, and it hasn't been very often that I've come to this book and given serious reflection and contemplation to the words recorded there. But we need to remember that, in 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse 11, it says the Old Testament is kept. It is preserved for our learning and for our benefit. That includes every page of the Old Testament. That includes every part of it. There is some reason why it is there. We're seeing that on Wednesday night in our study through the Song of Solomon, but there's a reason for the Old Testament to still be there, every part of it. And there's something to be learned. Perhaps we neglect the book of Lamentations because of its location in the Old Testament. I think as Christians, somewhat to a rightly so degree, we tend to stick to the New Testament more than the Old Testament. The Old Testament is challenging. It's so far removed from us, and it seems odd under the old law that sometimes we avoid it, perhaps because of its dark tone. The subject of Lamentations, as the name plainly suggests, is dealing with extreme grief, lamenting over dire circumstances and suffering. But it's here for a reason. I think this book is very applicable for us today, and I'm very excited to work our way through this text. And this is going to lead very well, as chapter 5 is essentially a call to prayer for the nation. That's going to lead well, as in the month of April, when we finish this series, I plan on doing some lessons on the subject of prayer, as that is our theme for the middle third of the year. So this will transition very well into another series of lessons that fit with our theme. But for now, let's just introduce. I have simple objectives this morning. I want to introduce the text, a little bit of background information about it, maybe a few lessons we can draw from the text going into it, and then we're just going to go one chapter at a time. But a little bit of background first. We typically just say this is written by Jeremiah. This is kind of like the book of Hebrews, where you might assume it was Paul, but there's no official name given to it. It's kind of the same thing here. I have no reason to seriously doubt that this was written by Jeremiah. But again, there's no name officially written to it, whereas, the names of the prophets are, that's the name of their books. This comes at the conclusion of Jeremiah's book in our Bibles, but that's not where it was originally. But it seems fitting for a number of reasons. It seems consistent with Jeremiah's tone and speaking and writing style. It seems to fit right at the end of Jeremiah chapter 52, which describes, by the way, this is our next step here, what's the conditions of Judah at this time. The last chapter of Jeremiah describes the destruction at the hands of the Babylonians, and Lamentations is about lamenting that destruction, the sad condition of the city and the few inhabitants who survive and those who are taken away as captives. So it does seem to fit with the idea that Jeremiah wrote it. But the context, again, has to deal with Jeremiah, or with Judah's unfaithfulness. Go to 2 Chronicles chapter 36. Now, 2 Chronicles, we looked at this text last year. We did a Wednesday night study on the Old Testament and how it flows together, the narrative overview of the Old Testament. This is a scripture you may recall that we emphasized in that Wednesday night Bible class because it is a great summary of why the things happened to Judah And why the things that happened to Israel, why they happened? Because of their unfaithfulness. Though Josiah, as a king, led a bit of a spiritual reform and restored proper worship to Judah for a time, it was too little too late. Really, the wickedness of Manasseh could not be undone, and the wickedness of other kings like Ammon and other wicked kings, they had just, Josiah could force the people to do the right things, but he couldn't change their hearts. And so they're in a condition where they were about to fall and be destroyed. Now, listen to the words in 2 Chronicles chapter 36. I'm going to begin in verse 15. And the Lord, the God of their fathers, sent word to them again and again by his messengers, because he had compassion on his people and on his dwelling place. But they continually mocked the messengers of God, despised his words, and scoffed at his prophets, until the wrath of the Lord arose against his people, until there was no remedy. And you could read through the rest of this chapter, but the reality is God gave them warning, and God told them, correct and amend your ways. If you go all the way back to Deuteronomy chapter 28, God said, as he's giving them this covenant, as they're agreeing to the terms of this covenant, God said, if you fail to be faithful, if you go after other idols, if you disregard my commandments and neglect my worship as I have ordained and commanded it of you, you will be destroyed. I will send in other nations to come and destroy you and take you away as captives. These were the warnings that God had given, and that's what we read in 2 Chronicles chapter 36. And so historically, Babylon was the one that came in and destroyed Judah. Now we know more than 100 years prior, around 722 BC, the Assyrians have already destroyed the 10 northern tribes of Israel. But Judah lasted a bit longer. But historically, in 606 or 605 BC, it's hard to be too precise with dates in this time period, the Babylonians came and took away captives, and Daniel was most likely among this first group of captives. Again, in 597, the Babylonians came and attacked and took away more captives. And then a third time, the Babylonians came, and 586 BC, they came and completely destroyed the city of Jerusalem. The overwhelming majority of small towns and cities around Jerusalem were completely destroyed as well. They destroyed the temple. They defiled the temple. They set a lot of the palaces and more beautiful and substantial structures in the city on fire. The gates were destroyed and removed. The walls were torn down. That's the story of Nehemiah. He came to rebuild the walls. So basically, this city was just completely and utterly destroyed. Before the destruction even took place, though, the Babylonians laid siege to the city for a time period of 18 months, some believe as long as 30 months, where they surrounded the city and shut up the inhabitants within, without fresh water, fresh food. The people inside starved and died from sickness before they even destroyed the city itself. Thousands upon thousands, easily tens of thousands, some people suggest even in the hundreds of thousands, died in 586 when the Babylonians destroyed this city. Now, the day this took place, bear in mind the Jewish calendar is based on the cycles of the moon, where ours is based on, the sun. It's a solar calendar. It was the 9th day of the month Av. They celebrate this yearly. Not really celebrate, but they memorialize it is more accurate. It's a day they refer to as Tisha B'Av, meaning the 9th day of Av. On this day, they remember several events in their history of destruction, several events of disasters in Jewish history, and the two most significant are the destruction of the temple here by the Babylonians, and again, the destruction of the temple when it was rebuilt in the days of Jesus, the destruction of that temple in AD 70 at the hands of the Romans. An interesting, perhaps coincidental, or perhaps the handiwork of God, an interesting little bit of information is the temples were both destroyed on the 9th day of Av, the same day of the month. I don't see that as coincidence, that God destroyed on the same day, several hundred years apart, these two temples in an act of judgment against his own people. So every year on this day, which on our calendars is usually July to August, somewhere in that time frame, among other things including a fast, they read the book of Lamentations in synagogues because it is a reminder of what took place, lamenting the disasters that befell them in those times. When you think about the destruction, here's a picture of Hiroshima in World War II after the nuclear bomb. Here's Dresden after it was bombed in World War II. These are once vibrant cities reduced to piles of rubble, a skeleton of their former life and glory. These are more relatable images as they came in our time period, but this is what we ought to think of when we think about the context of Lamentations and what happened there. Utter and complete destruction. The city is not even recognizable anymore as it once was. Now, this book structurally is incredibly interesting and beautiful, and there's a lot that we probably don't see reading it translated into English. Now, I said before, this comes at the end of Jeremiah's work in our Bibles, but originally this was grouped together with the writings, the poetic scriptures, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Job, Song of Solomon, those type of works, because this is poetry. This is something we probably don't recognize just reading it in English, but this was a collection of 5 poems. And I'll tell you, this is probably the single best book in the Bible as far as chapter and verse divisions are concerned. It's the only one where the chapter divisions are perfectly correct. Each chapter represents a standalone poem. This book is a collection of 5 individual poems. And looking at each one, it's neat the way it breaks down. You might notice in your scriptures, if you have your Bible open to Lamentations, that essentially each chapter is broken into 22 verses. Now, chapter 3 is a bit of an exception. It's just as long as the first 2 chapters, but chapter 3 is just broken into 66 shorter verses. But essentially, all 5 chapters are broken down into 22 lines or 22 stanzas. And there's something even further than that when we look in the Hebrew language that is missing in the English. Chapters 1, 2, and 4 are each an acrostic. If you're not familiar with an acrostic, sometimes you see a word where each letter represents, some bit of information, or you might kind of go through the alphabet. A for apple, B for bee, or whatever. You might go through that. And that's what we see here. So the idea is that the first letter of each verse is the letter from the Hebrew alphabet. Why are there 22 verses? Because there's 22 letters in the Hebrew alphabet. So verse 1 would start with their letter A. Verse 2 would start with the equivalent for the letter B. But of course, this is the Hebrew alphabet. So there's fewer letters, but do you see what I'm getting at here? This happens in other places in the scriptures as well. Psalm 119, you might recall that one of our elders, Paul, did a study on Psalm 119 some time ago, and that is also an acrostic, where each verse begins with the next letter of the Hebrew alphabet going all the way through each of these 22 characters. It's kind of like saying A to Z. Psalm 119 is A to Z, everything you could know about the scriptures. So you might think about this book as A to Z on grief or sorrow. Now, chapter 3 is a little bit different. It's broken up into 66 verses because there are 3 stanzas in each verse. Now, in chapter 3, what we're going to see here is that the first 3 lines of each verse or of each stanza all begin with the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet. The second set of 3 lines all begin with the second letter of the Hebrew alphabet, and so on and so forth. And I can show you a picture to help you understand what I mean. Now, Hebrew reads from right to left, but you'll notice here, chapter 3, you've got the 3 red letters. That would be their letter A, so to speak, the equivalent. Verses 4, 5, and 6 all begin with the next letter in the alphabet. And then you've got verses 7, 8, and 9. They would all start with that third letter of the alphabet, if that makes sense. So poetically, there's something going on here that we don't see. Chapter 3 seems to be kind of the culmination of intensity. It kind of builds to a peak, a crescendo, and then comes back down at the end. It builds in intensity through chapter 3. Now, chapter 5 is the oddball. And this happens in music and in poetry. You change things up to get attention. In public speaking, you go from loud to speaking softly or slowly. A change of pace gets your attention. Chapter 5, though it is divided into 22 verses, is not an acrostic. What we see here is somebody wrestling with their grief, somebody wrestling with their sorrow. If it was Jeremiah who wrote this, you need to imagine somebody in a pile of rubble, like the pictures I showed a minute ago. Somebody surrounded by the ruins of their home, their former life, surrounded by death, suffering, misery. And this is an expression of their emotions through this experience. That's why it's poetry. Poetry appeals to our senses and to our emotions. We are meant to feel what Jeremiah is feeling as he observes all of this happening. And this is very relatable. Chapter 3 is really the only chapter that offers any glimmer of hope. In fact, just go to chapter 3 for a moment. Lamentations chapter 3. And if you notice in verse 22, we just sang this song. You might not have even known this. The Lord's loving kindness indeed never cease, for his compassions never fail. They are new every morning. Great is thy faithfulness. The Lord is my portion, says my soul. Therefore I have hope in him. This book begins poetically in very bleak and dark and sorrowful language. It kind of builds to this crescendo of a little glimmer of hope in God, and then it kind of goes back out and finishes in a very dark way. That describes, I think, the faith of a lot of people in the midst of suffering. At your core is a solid faith that is still there, that still has hope in God, but that is not your present reality. You are going to hold on to your faith in God, like Jeremiah here. But at the moment, that's not what you're feeling. Your present reality is loss, grief, sorrow. This is very relatable on a human scale, and that brings us to the purpose of this book. You might be asking, is this simply a record of how sad people were when Jerusalem was destroyed? But beyond that, what benefit would it have for me? Well, this is here for a reason. We can learn from this. We can definitely learn from what's going on here. God allows the writer of this book to express his grief. And you'll notice without interruption, this is a book that it mentions God by name directly, but God does not speak directly in this book. God does allow his actions to speak. The fact that he foretold of this punishment and he is not relenting, and we see the suffering, that is God speaking, but that's not him speaking directly. He doesn't interrupt. You might see some parallels with this book and Job, but that's a difference. God does interrupt Job. Here's the difference I want to point out. Job is suffering, and there's no real reason why. Do you ever notice that God doesn't tell Job, oh, by the way, all of this calamity happened to you because Satan and I were having a conversation one day and we decided to use you as a test? God never tells that to Job. God simply says, who are you to ask such questions? Were you there at the creation? God interrupts and intervenes and speaks directly with Job. But there's two kinds of suffering we're talking about here with Job and Lamentations. Job is suffering, and that's the kind like we studied in Ecclesiastes recently. Time and chance happens to everybody. Sometimes there is no answer to the question of, why is this happening to me? Sometimes bad things just happen, and there is no reason why. There is no answer. And that's a suffering we have to deal with and learn to cope with. Lamentations, however, deals with suffering that is brought upon by your own actions. Lamentations deals with when you leave God out of your life and then he turns around after warning you and warning you and warning you, then says, okay, I will leave you out now. This is the kind of suffering that Lamentations deals with. There is a timeliness to grief as well. In Proverbs chapter 25 and verse 20, you know, we try to rush through grief a lot of times. You know, it's time to move on. It's time to get over it. We even kind of trivialize or gloss over suffering and loss sometimes. You know, we say quaint little statements when somebody dies. Well, heaven needed another angel, or not that we become angels when we die anyway, but, you know, we come up with these little sayings to try and say, okay, let's move on from this now. It's time to get past this. You know, I think that Lamentations teaches us that God allows him to just lay out his grief before him, and God doesn't interrupt. God is acknowledging that this is healthy. This is part of the grieving process. This is part of how you heal, is by expressing, lamenting over your suffering and grief. And God says, I'm not going to stop this. I'm going to let this happen because there's a timeliness to this that you shouldn't cut short or make too abrupt. Proverbs 25 and verse 20. Like one who takes off a garment on a cold day, or like vinegar on soda, you know, strong reactions, negative reactions, is he who sings songs to a troubled heart. There is a timeline here that should be acknowledged. Think of in Genesis 37, when all of Joseph's brothers come to their father and say, they lie to him, but they say, your son is dead. Genesis 37 and verse 34, so Jacob tore his clothes and put sackcloth on his loins and mourned for his son many days. Then all his sons and all his daughters arose to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted. Think of David in 2 Samuel chapter 12 and verse 17. He would not rise up to eat food. He continued in prayer and mourning for his child that was lost. Grief is something we shouldn't try to avoid or skip or take a shortcut through. That's the power of this book. That's the lesson that we learn. And we direct it towards God because he alone can heal us. God is faithful. And you're going to see this all throughout. There's an acknowledgement in this book. God, we know we caused this. We sinned and we brought this punishment on ourselves. But we also know, God, that you are the only one that can help us recover and heal from this. So there's this plea for help. God, will you act on our behalf? But there's also, it's balanced by this thought. We know we sinned. In Lamentations chapter 2, I already read from chapter 3 and verse 22, where he said, great is your faithfulness. There's this idea that we learn in this book that God is faithful to restore us, that God is willing to forgive, God is willing to restore and help us. But also, we learn about God's faithfulness, that he keeps his word, even regarding punishment. Chapter 2 and verse 17, the Lord has done what he purposed. He has accomplished his word, which he commanded from days of old. He has thrown down without sparing. He has caused the enemy to rejoice over you. He has exalted the might of your adversaries. This is saying, God has just carried out his threats from many years ago. Deuteronomy chapter 28. Go and read that text. And what happened with Babylon is precisely what God said would happen. And he gave them one prophet after another to warn them. Do you see the mercy of God here? 606, captives are taken. Many lives are spared, though. But you might think if you're a captive, woe is me. But your life is spared. The captives became the lucky ones. 597, more captives were taken. For years, God is just teetering on the edge of destroying them, but giving them just that little bit more time to repent. There is the mercy of God, sending the prophets to try and correct them. There is the mercy of God, warning them from the very beginning when he gave the law through Moses. There is the mercy of God. And this one might shock you. But even in destroying this city with thousands of lives lost and the amount of suffering, we see the mercy of God. We need to remember, keep a heavenly and spiritual perspective here. What matters most is not living a long life to 110 years old and dying peacefully in your bed. What matters most is being right with God and spending all eternity with him. What matters most is the condition of our soul. Think of how difficult it would be for a righteous person to live in a nation filled with idols that worship the gods of wealth and sex. Sound like any countries you've ever heard of? At some point, we have to consider this punishment as mercy from God, and that He sees the conditions and how difficult, how challenging it is to be a righteous person surrounded by such horrible sin that God had to intervene. There's going to be some great lessons we're going to learn from this text. But what I'd like to do for the remainder of our time, I'm going to ask something a little bit different. I'm going to put a black screen up for just a minute. You can follow along if you'd like, but I tried to cut this lesson short because what I want to do now is read Lamentations. I'm going to read from a version that I don't think anybody here has, the New Living Translation. This is typically not my preferred translation, but for poetry, I like the thought for thought concept of translation rather than literalness. The Jews did not have copies of God's law, each in their homes. They would gather together and hear the scriptures read. That's what I want to do this morning. I want you to listen. We aren't always good at that, but I want you to listen. We're going to read now the book of Lamentations. Jerusalem, once so full of people, is now deserted. She who was once great among the nations now sits alone like a window. Once the queen of all the earth, she is now a slave. She sobs through the night. Tears stream down her cheeks. Among all her lovers, there is no one left to comfort her. All her friends have betrayed her and become her enemies. Judah has been led away into captivity, oppressed with cruel slavery. She lives among foreign nations and has no place of rest. Her enemies have chased her down, and she has nowhere to run. The roads to Jerusalem are in mourning, for crowds no longer come to celebrate the festivals. The city gates are silent. Her priests groan. Her young women are crying. How bitter is her fate. Her oppressors have become her masters, and her enemies prosper, for the Lord has punished Jerusalem for her many sins. Her children have been captured and taken away to distant lands. All the majesty of beautiful Jerusalem has been stripped away. Her princes are like starving deer, searching for pasture. They are too weak to run from the pursuing enemy. In the midst of her sadness and wandering, Jerusalem remembers her ancient splendor. But now she has fallen to her enemy, and there is no one to help her. Her enemies struck her down and laughed as she fell. Jerusalem has sinned greatly, so she has been tossed away like a filthy rag. All who once honored her now despise her, for they have seen her stripped naked and humiliated. All she can do is groan and hide her face. She defiled herself with immorality and gave no thought to her future. Now she lies in the gutter with no one to lift her out. Lord, see my misery, she cries. The enemy has triumphed. The Lord has plundered her completely, taking every precious thing she owns. She has seen foreigners violate her sacred temple, the place the Lord had forbidden them to enter. Her people groan as they search for bread. They have sold their treasures for food to stay alive. O Lord, look, she mourns, and see how I am despised. Does it mean nothing to you, all you who pass by? Look around and see if there is any suffering like mine, which the Lord brought on me when he erupted in fierce anger. He has sent fire from heaven that burns in my bones. He has placed a trap in my path and turned me back. He has left me devastated, racked with sickness all day long. He wove my sin into ropes to hitch me to a yoke of captivity. The Lord sapped my strength and turned me over to my enemies. I am helpless in their hands. The Lord has treated my mighty men with contempt. At his command, a great army has come to crush my young warriors. The Lord has trampled his beloved city like grapes are trampled in a winepress. For all these things I weep, tears flow from my cheeks. No one is here to comfort me. Any who might encourage me are far away. My children have no future, for the enemy has conquered us. Jerusalem reaches out for help. but no one comforts her. Regarding his people Israel, the Lord has said, let their neighbors be their enemies. Let them be thrown away like a filthy rag. The Lord is right, Jerusalem says, for I rebelled against him. Listen, people everywhere, look upon my anguish and despair, for my sons and daughters have been taken captive to distant lands. I begged my allies for help, but they betrayed me. My priests and leaders starved to death in the city, even as they searched for food to save their lives. Lord, see my anguish. My heart is broken and my soul despairs, for I have rebelled against you. In the streets the sword kills, and at home there is only death. Others heard my groans, but no one turned to comfort me. When my enemies heard my troubles, they were happy to see what you had done. Oh, bring the day you promised, when they will suffer as I have suffered. Look at all their evil deeds, Lord. Punish them as you have punished me for all my sins. My groans are many, and I am sick at heart. Poem 2. The Lord, in his anger, has cast a dark shadow over beautiful Jerusalem. The fairest of Israel's cities lies in the dust, thrown down from the heights of heaven in his days of great anger. The Lord has shown no mercy even to his temple. Without mercy, the Lord has destroyed every home in Israel. In his anger, he has broken down the fortress walls of beautiful Jerusalem. He has brought them to the ground, dishonoring the kingdom and its rulers. All the strength of Israel vanishes beneath his fierce anger. The Lord has withdrawn his protection as the enemy attacks. He consumes the whole land of Israel like a raging fire. He bends his bow against his people as though they were their enemy. His strength is used against them to kill their finest youth. His fury is poured out like fire on beautiful Jerusalem. Yes, the Lord has vanquished Israel like an enemy. He has destroyed her palaces and demolished her fortresses. He has brought unending sorrow and tears upon beautiful Jerusalem. He has broken down his temple as though it were merely a garden shelter. The Lord has blotted out all memory of the holy festivals and Sabbath days. Kings and priests fall together before his fierce anger. The Lord has rejected his own altar. He despises his own sanctuary. He has given Jerusalem's palaces to her enemies. They shout in the Lord's temple as though it were a day of celebration. The Lord is determined to destroy the walls of beautiful Jerusalem. He made careful plans for their destruction, then did what he planned. Therefore the ramparts and walls have fallen down before him. Jerusalem's gates have sunk into the ground. He has smashed their locks and bars. Her kings and princes have been exiled to distant lands. Her law has ceased to exist. Her prophets receive no more visions from the Lord. The leaders of beautiful Jerusalem sit on the ground in silence. They are clothed in burlap and throw dust on their heads. The young women of Jerusalem hang their heads in shame. I have cried until the tears no longer come. My heart is broken. My spirit is poured out in agony, and I see the desperate plight of my people. Little children and tiny babies are fainting and dying in the streets. They cry out to their mothers, "We need food and drink." Their lives ebb away in the streets like the life of a warrior wounded in battle. They gasp for life. They collapse in their mother's arms. What can I say about you? Who has seen such sorrow, O daughter of Jerusalem? To what can I compare your anguish, O virgin daughter of Zion? How can I comfort you? For your wound is as deep as the sea. Who can heal you? Your prophets had said so many foolish things, false to the core. They did not save you from exile by pointing out your sins. Instead, they painted false pictures, filling you with false hope. All who pass by jeer at you. They scoff and insult beautiful Jerusalem, saying, "Is this the city called the most beautiful in all the world and the joy of all the earth?" All your enemies mock you. They scoff and snarl and say, "We have destroyed her at last. We have long awaited for this day, and it is finally here." But the Lord, who did just as he planned, it is the Lord who did just as he planned. He has fulfilled the promises of disaster he made long ago. He has destroyed Jerusalem without mercy. He has caused her enemies to gloat over her and has given them power over her. Cry aloud before the Lord, O walls of beautiful Jerusalem. Let your tears flow like a river day and night. Give rest. Give yourselves no rest. Give your eyes no relief. Rise during the night and cry out. Pour your hearts like water to the Lord. Lift up your hands to him in prayer. Plead for your children, for in every street they are faint with hunger. O Lord, think about this. Should you treat your own people this way? Should mothers eat their own children? Those they once bounced on their knees? Should priests and prophets be killed within the Lord's temple? See them lying in the streets, young and old, boys and girls, killed by the swords of the enemy. You have killed them in your anger, slaughtering them without mercy. You have invited terrors from all around, as though you were calling them to a day of feasting in the day of the Lord's anger. No one has survived. The enemy has killed all the children whom I carried and raised. Poem 3. I am the one who has seen the afflictions that come from the rod of the Lord's anger. He has led me into darkness, shutting out all light. He has turned his hand against me again and again all day long. He has made my skin and flesh grow old. He has broken my bones. He has besieged and surrounded me with anguish and distress. He has buried me in a dark place like those long dead. He has walled me in and I cannot escape. He has bound me in heavy chains. And though I cry and shout, he has shut out my prayers. He has blocked my way with a high stone. He has made my road crooked. He has hidden like a bear or a lion waiting to attack me. He has dragged me off the path and torn me in pieces, leaving me helpless and devastated. He has drawn his bow and made me the target for his arrows. He shot his arrows deep into my heart. My own people laugh at me. All day long they sing their mocking songs. He has filled me with bitterness and given me a bitter cup of sorrow to drink. He has made me chew on gravel. He has rolled me in the dust. Peace has been stripped away and I have forgotten what prosperity is. I cry out, my splendor is gone. Everything I hoped for from the Lord is lost. The thought of my suffering and homelessness is bitter beyond words. I will never forget this awful time as I grieve over my loss. Yet I still dare to hope when I remember this. The faithful love of the Lord never ends. His mercies never cease. Great is his faithfulness. His mercies begin afresh. Each morning I say to myself, the Lord is my inheritance. Therefore, I will hope in him. The Lord is good to those who depend on him, to those who search for him. So it is good to wait quietly for salvation from the Lord, and it is good for people to submit at an early age to the yoke of his discipline. Let them sit alone in silence beneath the Lord's demands. Let them lie face down in the dust, for there may be hope at last. Let them turn the other cheek to those that strike them and accept the insults of their enemies. For no one is abandoned by the Lord forever. Though he brings grief, he also shows compassion because of the greatness of his unfailing love, for he does not enjoy hurting people or causing them sorrow. If people crush underfoot all the prisoners of the land, if they deprive others of their rights in defiance of the Most High, if they twist justice in the courts, doesn't the Lord see all these things? Who can command things to happen without the Lord's permission? Does not the Most High send both calamity and good? Then why should we, mere humans, complain when we are punished for our sins? Instead, let us test and examine our ways. Let us turn back to the Lord. Let us lift our hearts and hands to God in heaven and say, we have sinned and rebelled. You have not forgiven us. You have engulfed us with your anger, chased us down, and slaughtered us without mercy. You have hidden yourself in a cloud so our prayers cannot reach you. You have discarded us as refuse and garbage among the nations. All our enemies have spoken out against us. We are filled with fear, for we are trapped, devastated, and ruined. Tears stream from my eyes because of the destruction of my people. My tears flow endlessly. They will not stop until the Lord looks down from heaven and sees. My heart is breaking over the fate of all the women of Jerusalem. My enemies, whom I have never harmed, hunted me down like a bird. They threw me into a pit and dropped stones on me. The water rose over my head, and I cried out, this is the end. But I called on your name, Lord, from deep within the pit. You heard me when I cried. Listen to my pleading. Hear my cry for help. Yes, you came when I called. You told me, do not fear. Lord, you have come to my defense. You have redeemed my life. You have seen the wrong they have done to me, Lord. Be my judge and prove me right. You have seen the vengeful plots my enemies have laid against me. Lord, you have heard the vile names they call me. You know all about the plans they have made. My enemies whisper and mutter as they plot against me all day long. Look at them. Whether they sit or stand, I am the object of their mocking songs. Pay them back, Lord, for all the evil they have done. Give them hard and stubborn hearts, and then let your curse fall on them. Chase them down in your anger, destroying them beneath the Lord's heavens. Poem 4. How the gold has lost its luster. Even the finest gold has become dull. The sacred gemstones lie scattered in the streets. See how the precious children of Jerusalem, worth their weight in fine gold, are now treated like pots of clay made by a common potter. Even the jackals feed their young, but not my people Israel. They ignore their children's cries like ostriches in the desert. The parched tongues of their little ones stick to the roofs of their mouths in thirst. The children cry for bread, but no one has any to give them. The people who once ate the richest foods now beg in the streets for anything they can get. Those who once wore the finest clothes now search the garbage dumps for food. The guilt of my people is greater than that of Sodom, where utter disaster struck in a moment and no hand offered help. Our princes once glowed with health, brighter than snow, whiter than milk. Their faces were as ruddy as rubies, their appearance like fine jewels. But now their faces are blacker than soot. No one recognizes them in the streets. Their skin sticks to their bones. It is as dry and hard as wood. Those killed by the sword are better off than those who die of hunger. Starving, they waste away for lack of food from the fields. Tender-hearted women have cooked their own children. They have eaten them to survive the siege. Now the anger of the Lord is satisfied. His fierce anger has been poured out. He started a fire in Jerusalem that burned the city to its foundations. Not a king in all the earth, no one in all the world would have believed that an enemy could march through the gates of Jerusalem. Yet it happened because of the sins of her prophets and the sins of her priests who defiled the city by shedding innocent blood. They wandered blindly through the streets, so defiled by blood that no one dared touch them. Get away, the people shouted at them. You're defiled, don't touch us. So they fled to distant lands and wandered among foreign nations, but no one would let them stay. The Lord himself has scattered them, and he no longer helps them. People show no respect for the priests and no longer honor the leaders. We looked in vain for our allies to come and save us, but we were looking to nations that could not help us. We couldn't go into the streets without danger to our lives. Our end was near, our days were numbered, we were doomed. Our enemies were swifter than eagles in flight. If we fled to the mountains, they found us. If we hid in the wilderness, they were waiting for us there. Our king, the Lord's anointed, the very life of our nation, was caught in their snares. We had thought that his shadow would protect us against any nation on earth. Are you rejoicing in the land of Uz, O people of Edom? But you, too, must drink from the cup of the Lord's anger. You, too, will be stripped naked in your drunkenness. O beautiful Jerusalem, your punishment will end. You will soon return from exile. But Edom, your punishment is just beginning. Soon your many sins will be exposed. And the final poem. Lord, remember what has happened to us. See how we have been disgraced. Our inheritance has been turned over to strangers, our homes to foreigners. We are orphaned and fatherless. Our mothers are widowed. We have to pay for water to drink, and even firewood is expensive. Those who pursue us are at our heels. We are exhausted but are given no rest. We submitted to Egypt and Assyria to get enough food to survive. Our ancestors sinned, but they have died, and we are suffering the punishment they deserved. Slaves have now become our masters. There is no one left to rescue us. We hunt for food at the risk of our lives, for violence rules the countryside. The famine has blackened our skin as though baked in an oven. Our enemies rape the women in Jerusalem and the young girls in all the towns of Judah. Our princes are being hanged by their thumbs, and our elders are treated with contempt. Young men are led away to work at millstones, and boys stagger under heavy loads of wood. The elders no longer sit in the city gates. The young men no longer dance and sing. Joy has left our hearts. Our dancing has turned to mourning. The garlands have fallen from our heads. Weep for us because we have sinned. Our hearts are sick and weary, and our eyes grow dim with tears. For Jerusalem is empty and desolate, a place haunted by jackals. But Lord, you remain the same forever. Your throne continues from generation to generation. Why do you continue to forget us? Why have you abandoned us for so long? Restore us, O Lord, and bring us back to you again. Give us back the joys we once had. Or have you utterly rejected us? Are you angry with us still? We're going to sing the invitation song now, and as we look through this text in coming weeks, let it sink in and be reminded of the consequences of our rebellion against God. If there's any way we can help you reconcile to God, be right with God, we invite you to come forward now as we stand and sing.